Well, our sermon series is Beyond the Manger, looking at the early life of Jesus. And when we left Jesus last week, he was about 2 years old. He and Mary and Joseph went to Egypt to escape King Herod, who wanted to kill him. And after Herod died, then they went back to Nazareth, and we assume they tried to pick up their lives again. The next thing the Bible tells us about the life of Jesus is 10 years later, when Jesus was 12. And we'll talk about that story in a minute, but don't you wonder sometimes what happened with Jesus in those 10 years? Don't you wonder what Jesus was like when he was a kid? Was he like any other normal kid? Did he run around with his friends? Did he play with toys and misbehave and get into trouble occasionally? I know we're talking about the divine Son of God here, but still we say that Jesus was fully human as well as fully divine. And a little kid misbehaving once in a while is not sin. A little kid behaving once in a while is what a little kid does. It's just sometimes that's how little kids learn, is by doing that. It's just a little kid being a little kid. And Mary and Joseph obviously knew who their child was, that he was the divine Son of God, because the angel Gabriel and the disciples and the shepherds and the rest of them had told him. But would an outsider, just observing Jesus growing up, would an outsider have known that there was something different, something special about Jesus? Or would Jesus have looked like just another little kid running around Nazareth? We'll never know, of course. And now Jesus is 12. And understand, a 12-year-old back then was considered a lot closer to an adult than a 12-year-old is today. He would not have been an adult yet, not considered an adult, but he would not have been all that far off, really. But Jesus is still growing up. He's still living with his parents. And every year when the Passover came, Jesus and Mary and Joseph would go to Jerusalem to celebrate it there. That's what good Jews did, at least those who lived within a reasonable distance of Jerusalem. I've read that it was about a 5-day trip from Nazareth to Jerusalem, and by this time, Mary and Joseph probably had some other children, because we know from other passages in the Bible that Mary and Joseph did eventually have other children. They go to the Passover festival, they do all the things they're supposed to do, and they head for home. And Jesus is not with them, but they're not too worried about that, because people back then did not just travel as one family, they traveled in a big group. There would have been lots of people going from Nazareth to Jerusalem for the Passover, and now they're all coming back. And so Jesus was not with them, and they were not real worried about that. After all, Jesus is not a little kid anymore. He's 12. He's around somewhere. They'll find him later. But then night falls, and they cannot find Jesus anywhere. They go around to all the people in the group, and they say, well, have you seen Jesus? And nobody's seen him. So they head back to Jerusalem, and can you imagine how panicked they must have been at that point? It'd be horrible to have lost your child under any circumstances, but you're the parents of the Savior, the Messiah, the divine Son of God. You've gone and lost him. What's God going to have to say about that? So they search. And think about how hard that search would have been. Jerusalem was a city, and you read pretty wildly differing estimates about how big it was, but it's not like it was a small town. And of course, you had no mass communication back then. You could not put out an Amber Alert or anything like that. Could not even put his picture on a milk carton. All Mary and Joseph could have done is go house to house, building to building, asking people if they'd seen Jesus. It took 3 days. 3 days of wondering where Jesus might be. Wondering if they'd ever see him again. Wondering if maybe somehow this could have all been part of God's plan. This is how it's supposed to happen, maybe. Hoping that anyway. And then they find him in the temple courts. And we don't know why they even went to the temple courts to look. But they did. They find Jesus there. He's just talking with all these teachers like he's their equal. He's asking them questions. He's responding to their questions. Amazing everybody with his understanding. His parents tell him how worried they've been, and he says, well, why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I'd have to be in my Father's house? But of course, then Jesus went back to Nazareth with Mary and Joseph and continued to mature and grow in wisdom, we're told. And as usual, there are a lot of things that we could take from this story, a lot of angles we could go down. But one of the things that's always interested me about Jesus is this. At what point in Jesus' life on earth did he really understand who he was and what he was supposed to do while he was on earth? Now, some might say that he knew it from the moment he was born, and I cannot dispute that if that's what you believe, because after all, we are talking about the divine Son of God here. If you believe that even as a baby, Jesus knew who he was and how his life was going to go, I have no basis to argue with you. But what I suspect is that Jesus had to go through a process of understanding who he was. Now, don't get me wrong. I still believe, as I said a couple weeks ago, that Jesus was the Messiah, the King, from the moment that he was born, just like the wise men said. And he may have had some sense of that right away. But I still think that he had to grow. He had to develop. He had to mature. Because after all, it was not until Jesus was about 30 years old that he started his ministry, and I have to think there's a reason for that. And I also have to think that Jesus made good use of those 30 years somehow. I think there's some sense in which Jesus had to learn who he was supposed to be, who he was sent here to be. And I think there's even a sense of that throughout Jesus' ministry, because, early on, he has times where he gets really angry and frustrated with people, including the disciples sometimes, when he's telling them these things, and they just don't seem to get it. They just don't seem to understand. Jesus seems to get really frustrated with that. But by the end, Jesus appears to be more sad when people don't understand, when they just don't get it. He's resigned to that. He understands that's just the way people are. That's how it's going to be. It's not really their fault. And in the final analysis, he understands that's why he was sent here to save us. Because we'd never be able to do it on our own. And I think there's a sense in which that's the journey we all go through in life. We start out with some sense of who we are, but we have to grow. We have to develop. We have to mature. We have to learn how to be who we're supposed to be. We have to learn how to be who we were created to be. And it's not always an easy process. It was not always an easy process for Jesus. He was the divine Son of God. So it's certainly not always going to be an easy process for us. A lot of stuff happens to us along the way of our lives. Sometimes that stuff knocks us off the path. Knocks us off the path of becoming who we were created to be. And sometimes it can take a long time for us to get back on that path. As you know, as many of you know at least, it took me a long time to figure out who I was created to be, and I'm not saying that I'm necessarily there yet. Certainly I have a lot of things to improve, a lot of things to work on, but what I mean is that I was 47 years old before I became a pastor. Before that happened, I did a lot of things trying to find some sense of meaning, some sense of purpose in my life. And I did try a lot of different things. Some of them were work-related and some of them were not. But I had a sense that I was not yet who I was supposed to be, that there was a hole in my life and I was trying to fill it with all sorts of things. I had to learn how to be who I was created to be, and it was not always an easy process. And the point here is not to build myself up as any sort of role model. The point is, I think this is something that happens to a lot of us. We take a long time sometimes to learn how to be who we're supposed to be, who we were created to be. And it's a struggle sometimes. We know that there's a hole in our lives. We try to fill it with all sorts of things. And sometimes we get angry, and sometimes we get frustrated, both with ourselves and with other people. And sometimes we get sad, both because of who we are and because of other people sometimes. And sometimes it takes us a long time to get on the right path. And so for me, thinking about Jesus' life in this way gives me a lot of hope. And I hope it gives you some hope too. Because if even Jesus had to learn how to be who he was supposed to be, and if even Jesus struggled to do that sometimes, then it's okay for us to struggle too. It's okay for you and me to have trouble figuring out who it is that we were created to be. It's okay if we need time to grow, to develop, to mature. It's okay if we don't have it all figured out by the time we're 30. It's okay if we don't have it all figured out by the time we're 47. Seems to me that Jesus was continuing to grow and to mature and to develop right up to the end of his life on earth. And I think you and I can expect to do that too. But think about what helped Jesus in his struggles. It's what he told Mary and Joseph when they found him in the temple. He needed to be in his Father's house. He needed to stay as close to God as he could. And he knew that if he did that, God would help him figure it all out. God would show him who he was supposed to be. And that's what you and I need to do too, I think. We need to stay just as close to God as we can. And if we do that, God will help you and me figure it all out too, just as God the Father did for Jesus. God will show us who we are supposed to be, who we were created to be. And then, it's just a matter of us following where God shows us to go. Life is a journey, and it's a process. And sometimes it's a struggle. But if we stay close to God, God will help us through those struggles. God doesn't promise to take the struggles away, but God will help us through those struggles. And God will show us how to be who we were created to be. God will be there with us every step of the way, just as God the Father was for Jesus. Amen.